So welcome to everyone from wherever you have joined us. We especially welcome our speakers, Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi and David Loy. My name is Raimund Hopp from Mitgefühl in Aktion, that means Compassion in Action in Germany. And this is our first shared event with our mother organization, Buddhist Global Relief. And we hope you will get a lot of inspiration from today's talk. And now Simpert Würfel, the chair of Mitgefühl in Aktion, will open the session with a song. Welcome, Simpert.
I will start with a little song based on a poem of Wendell Berry, which has been sung by the people in Plum Village. And I sing it in a version of our loved friend Ayya Yeshe. Lay down my burden, lay down my burden, lay down my burden, lay down my burden. When I rise, let me rise like a bird joyfully. And when I fall, let me fall like a leaf gracefully without regret.
Thank you, Simpert. Now I would like to ask Carla Prater, Associate Director of Buddhist Global Relief, to say a word of welcome.
On behalf of all of us at Buddhist Global Relief, I welcome you to the conversation between the Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi and David Loy on the Buddhist response to a world in crisis. This event is organized jointly by Buddhist Global Relief and our European sister organization, Mitgefühl in Aktion, in benefit of charitable projects supported by BGR and MIA around the world. Thank you for attending and supporting our work. We hope you enjoy the conversation.
Now, dear friends, our world today is in the midst of a tremendous crisis, the likes of which have never been seen in history. According to the United Nations World Food Programme's Global Report on Food Crisis from this year, which has just been released, the original goal of ending world hunger by 2030 appears completely impossible. More than 155 million people worldwide were affected by acute food insecurity at crisis level, or worse, in 2020, an increase of 20 million over 2019 and a 5-year high, driven by ongoing conflicts, pre-existing and COVID-19 related economic shocks, climate change, and severe weather extremes. In addition, the greatest challenges facing the global community are ethnic and racial violence, environmental destruction, and the rise of authoritarian governments. Dear Bhante Bodhi and David Loy, honorable and engaged Buddhist teachers, what are the Buddhist responses to a world in crisis? Or does Buddhism need to transform itself to contribute active solutions to today's crisis? We welcome you very warmly.
Okay, maybe I will begin by sort of fleshing out some of these crises that the world is facing right now. The reason why we speak about the world in crisis. And then we could explore a little bit what kind of response that Buddhism can make to these crises. Okay, so I've listed in my notes about 4 of them. So I think one of them is almost obscenely widening economic inequality. And since I'm speaking from within the United States, so it's both internal to the United States, and probably it's characteristic of virtually every advanced economic country, though I think probably it's worse in the United States than in most other countries. And also I think the economic inequality is widening globally, so that more and more of the world's wealth is being funneled and channeled into the so-called economically developed countries and away from the so-called developing countries. And as a result of this, we have a very small but powerful economic elite that owns the great majority of the world's wealth, while billions are living in abject poverty, subject to perpetual hunger, homelessness, incurable illnesses that are easily curable if medical assistance were provided, and poor medical services, and so forth. And we saw an example of this weekend when somebody like Richard Branson can go make a trip with some of his friends to outer space, while close to 1 billion people are having trouble getting enough to eat, and millions of people around the world are infected with the COVID virus and not able to get the vaccinations that they need to protect themselves. Okay, so this is one problem. Another problem is, again, this is one which is quite characteristic of the United States, but it probably has parallels around the world, and that is the persistence of racism in multifaceted ways, both overt and subtle, and both being legally sanctioned. And so we have some examples: police shootings of Black people, almost without consequences for the police. One of the rare exceptions was the police officer who killed George Floyd and has been convicted and sentenced, but that's one of the few exceptions. Then we have the persistence of the so-called prison industrial complex. There are these large privately owned prisons which thrive on having a constant supply of inmates, and most of those, or at least a great number of them, are Black people or other people of color. Then we have for Black people and other minorities, poor housing, rampant unemployment, persisting poverty. And now what's become a very dangerous development here in the US is the whole raft of voter suppression bills, which are going through state legislatures, which are seriously constricting the ability of Black people and other minorities to vote in elections, and which will be shifting the balance of power in the country again towards the white minority represented by the Republican Party. Okay, a third problem that we have is in the US, extremely high, again, I'm always mentioning the United States, but there are probably problems like this in other countries as well. But in the United States, extremely high spending on military. I think over half of the discretionary budget is spent on the military, and the US military spending is roughly higher than that of the next 10 countries, far higher than the targeted enemies of the United States, the Russia and China. And we're constantly developing new weapon systems, including new systems of nuclear weapons, for which there's even $1 trillion is being invested in that money, which can be used in much more socially beneficial ways. And then a fourth problem, in a way, the problem which overshadows and underlies everything else, is that of climate change and other types of environmental destruction, including the biodiversity loss, reckless policies of land clearance, loss of forests and other types of greenery, and pollution by plastics. Okay, so these are some of the problems that I would say which in concert are plunging this world into extremely grave crisis. I see my friend Philip Murphy is on the call, and that reminds me of another aspect of the crisis that we're facing regarding, you could call it broadly, the environment, which doesn't get so much attention, and that is the terrible destruction of animal life, of non-human sentient life, which goes on, almost beneath the threshold of public awareness. And yet, the human flourishing on this planet depends not only on preserving things like our forests and greenery, but also on preserving other life forms in which human life is intricately interwoven and interconnected. So please feel welcome to follow up.
Yeah, thank you. I'm very happy to follow up a little bit on that. I think that's a wonderful way of situating our situation today, and I think I would simply want to add some elements to it. Starting with something that Noam Chomsky actually said in an interview last year. I don't know if people are familiar with him, but he's a very, very important sort of political critic. Chomsky said that humanity is now living in the most dangerous time ever in the history of humanity, right? In our species history, which is quite an extraordinary thing to say. And as a history buff, I immediately sort of tried to think of some counterexamples, but I couldn't really. When you consider that what we do or don't do in the next decade or so could have repercussions for many hundreds or many thousands of years. So I just mentioned that as a way of sort of contextualizing the challenge that we're facing today. And as a way of following up to what Bhante said, I would like to reinforce that in a couple ways. One of them, he started out by talking about the extraordinary gap between rich and poor that is not only obscenely large, but is increasing as we talk, which is quite extraordinary. And of course, the COVID pandemic has just made that worse. A statistic that I came across recently, maybe it's off a little bit, I don't know, but the estimate was that 1% of the people in the world now control about 50% of its wealth and resources. Whereas turning that around, the bottom 50% of the world only have about 1% of the world's resources. I mean, again, even if that's not exactly right, the fact that it's even in the ballpark is just something that I think should immediately sort of grab our attention. And of course, what that highlights is, I think, the special, shall we say, kind of unique problem or no, special challenge for Buddhism today, because that's not simply due to individual greed. We also have to face the fact that the problem of dukkha now isn't something that's simply operating on an individual level, but it's institutionalized, it's systematic, it's now structural. And that's very much at the heart of the challenge I think we face today, given that Buddhism traditionally has focused on my individual dukkha due to my own individual karma and actions. There's this big challenge of how do we understand Buddhist teachings in the light of these institutional challenges. Another point that occurred to me, Bhante spoke about racism, and I think that's extremely important. I appreciate the emphasis here on the intersectionality. We know that these problems are implicated, that people of color tend to be much poorer than white people, certainly in the United States. And likewise, when it comes to ecological issues such as climate change, they're often suffering much more given the location of where they are. So in addition to the emphasis on the intersectionality here, I would, again, want to broaden the question that we're not just talking about racism, but we have a problem with what might be called tribalism in general. And I mention that because I think we need to even consider things like the nation state, the role that the nation state is playing in terms of causing dukkha, in terms of reinforcing the kinds of economic inequalities, reinforcing militarism, obviously, that these are considerations that I think really form a challenge for the Buddhist tradition. And I think a really good challenge, but I guess I guess what I'm coming down to is, if it's the case, and it's not that I believe this, but I think this is a challenge to the extent that if Buddhism can't help us understand and respond to these particular kinds of crises that we're facing today, then maybe Buddhism isn't what the world needs, right? Now, I'm kind of saying that in an indirect fashion because obviously simply by having this conversation, we believe that Buddhism has a great deal to offer. But it really puts the impetus on us that this really has to be the kind of growing tip of the Buddhist tradition in terms of how traditional Buddhist teachings and practices and ways of understanding the world, how they can be applied to actually respond to the situation that we're in right now. The only other thing that I would add for the moment is reinforcing the connection that Bhante made between climate change and other ecological issues, except frankly, I don't like to talk about climate change. That's a bit too anodyne, or I mean, I think if we talk about climate at all, it should be climate crisis or climate emergency. But even more fundamentally, I think we need to realize that that's really just the tip of a much larger ecological crisis, or you could say even ecological nightmare. And the reason why I think it's so important to emphasize that is I think in the establishment, there's still a lot of thinking that if we can simply shift quickly enough from fossil fuel sources of energy to renewables, then we can kind of continue with the sort of economic and political system we've had. And the crisis, the challenge here is much greater. It really ultimately, I think, comes back to our relationship to the earth and our alienation from the natural world, which I think is something we'll probably be getting into in a bit. So let me leave it at that for the moment and turn the microphone back over to Bhante.
Okay, so thank you for those observations. Yeah, you spoke about how now we're facing collective dukkha rather than simply individual dukkha, and how the Buddha's teaching was originally sort of formulated to solve the problem of individual dukkha or individual suffering. But I think if one really looks deeply into individual dukkha, one can see that the underlying roots of individual dukkha are very much the same as the underlying roots of collective dukkha. The problem that we face, though, is that for an individual to tackle the roots of their own individual dukkha, their greed, hatred, and delusion, their craving and ignorance, is, I don't want to say that it's easy, but it's fairly within the range of feasibility. The problem is that the underlying causes of collective dukkha, the dukkha that infects political, social, economic systems, is the underlying roots of that kind of dukkha are so pervasive and reinforced by, in a sense, those underlying roots express themselves, give rise to, and embody themselves within systems. And then those systems have ways of covering up the roots and reinforcing their hold on the entire system. And I mentioned two ways that occurred to me that the system does this. One is the way, and I know this sounds rather worldly for somebody who's supposed to be an otherworldly monk to be speaking this way, but the way those at the helm, in the control room of the economic system, virtually dominate and this is especially true in the United States, dominate the political system, because our political system is so configured that for politicians to succeed in their campaigns, at least with very few exceptions who've appeared recently, they depend on large donations from extremely wealthy people and from corporations and foundations that have a lot of wealth at their disposal. And so the politicians, if they want to get the donations they need to maintain their political careers, they have to submit to the decrees that are coming from the corporations and the ultra-rich people, who in many cases actually, through some of their foundations, write the laws that the politicians are expected to pass and to approve of. So that's one way in which that grip, in which these systems are so intricately interconnected that the collective expressions of the roots is able to suppress attempts to address the underlying roots themselves. And the other sort of related to that is the way, again, these powerful economic interests control to a great extent the press, what used to be called the press and the media, so that the media throw out the messages that meet the demands of the economic interests. And so they, in a sense, deceive the general public with disinformation, false information, biased opinions, which lead the general public to support those politicians who are in the control of the economic interests. And so we have a very, very difficult system to transform. Even though I would say that Buddhism can provide, I say, very keen, very acute, even very penetrating analysis of the causes of this collective dukkha. But the problem is finding the means to actually implement on the ground significant changes. Okay, maybe David, you would.
Thank you, Bhante. I think another way of expressing that, especially the first part of what you said, is how the three poisons, which I usually translate as greed, ill will, delusion, within the tradition, they've usually been understood as functioning in an individual, personal level. And I think the point we're both making here is that they have become institutionalized. And by institutionalized, it seems to me, that means they in a way have taken on a life of their own. That they're not simply dependent upon, say, the greed of individuals, but if the individuals don't function to promote the kind of growth that corporations expect, even the CEOs will be pushed out and somebody else will be brought in. So, this is, as far as I know, within the Buddhist tradition, this is a new kind of challenge. The way that greed, ill will, delusion have been articulated, it's usually not been expressed that way. It strikes me as one of the main ways that corporate power in the U.S. has tried to defend itself from the pressures to get off fossil fuels is the way that they have tried to persuade us that, the problem is individual consumption, right? Reduce your own individual carbon footprint. And I think we all know that that is indeed something that is important for us to do. And yet the idea of reducing the problem, say, of fossil fuel emissions simply to the individual level is really very dangerous when we have to understand what Bhante was saying about the pressure, the role, say, of fossil fuel corporations with the government and the kinds of laws that the government has passed. Frankly, it seems to me, and I'd be interested in Bhante's perspective on this. It seems to me that Shakyamuni Buddha, the historical Buddha, was quite a bit more progressive or more aware of these issues than the institution that developed after he died. I mean, when I look, for example, and I'm not referring, of course, to sort of corporate power, but I mean his understanding of sort of collective dukkha. When I look at his attitude toward women, the fact that he created a bhikkhuni sangha, or when I look at his attitude toward caste, the way that when people joined the sangha, they lost caste, that implies to me a kind of understanding that was pretty quickly lost as the tradition developed, as patriarchy reasserted itself, and as the Buddhist sanghas wanted, they wanted to be supported by the state, so that they weren't going to challenge it in the way that maybe some of the Old Testament, say, prophets did. In other words, I'm wondering how much the emphasis in Buddhism on individual transformation was a kind of deflection. It's like Buddhism was allowed to develop as long as it focused on that and wasn't offering any kind of challenge to the particular polities, the kings or the emperors or anyone like that. So that's a question for Bhante. But before I turn it back to you, the other issue that I notice is, and certainly I see this very strongly in Zen communities, if the problem is on the individual level, then we can address it on the individual level. But if the problem is institutional, as we're talking, that really requires really strong sanghas. It's like you need organizations to address the problems. And frankly, what I still see in American Buddhism, at least, is how I think that's still a weakness in that if we think of this three treasures, Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, we have lots of teachers, we have plenty of teachings, but sometimes I think our sanghas are still very weak. Certainly in the Zen world, where what happens? You go to a retreat, you're quiet, maybe you hear a Dharma talk by the master, you have a one-on-one, but except for a little bit of chat over tea at the end, there's no sort of sangha building, and then often people sort of go back to their homes. And I'm seeing this as part of the necessary Buddhist response, that we have stronger sanghas among ourselves. So maybe I'll one final comment regarding the relationship between the economic and the social, the economic and the political. I think, this is a common problem, that even in the best democracy, there are going to be people, again, motivated by the three poisons or whatever, who are going to want to try to subvert it for their own personal interest. And in this regard, I think Marx, although I'm not at all a Marxist, but Marx's basic understanding that the people who control the economic system are going to control the political system, I think we can see that operating to a large degree here. And of course, the media that Bhante was referring to are also a corporate themselves. So for them, the ultimate goal is not educating or informing us, but usually finding ways to grab our eyeballs and sell them to the highest bidder. So it's that interlocking system that we need to address. So anyway, enough from me. I'll turn it back over to Bhante.
Yeah, beginning with your initial comment about the Shakyamuni Buddha, the historical Buddha, apart from things like his rejection of the caste system within the monastic order itself, the permission for the ordination of women and so forth, one does find some signs of what I would call critical social diagnosis within the Buddha's teachings. One example comes to mind is a series of terms. We find it in the Mahanidana Sutta, the Great Discourse on Causation, Sutta number 15 in the Digha Nikaya. And in that same passage, we find in the Anguttara Nikaya, Book of Nines, where he looks for the underlying roots of social this is a sutta. It's in the Anguttara Nikaya, Book of 9, Sutta number 23, where the Buddha speaks about 9 things rooted in craving. And some of them seem redundant, but he says dependence, and dependence on craving, there is seeking. Dependence on seeking, there is gain. Dependence on gain, there is judgment. Then desire and attachment, then possessiveness, then miserliness, then safeguarding. Then based on safeguarding, there is the taking up of rods and weapons, quarrels, contentions, and disputes, accusations, divisive and false speech, and many other bad, unwholesome things, eventually rooted in craving. So you can see here, like there's an attempt to sort of trace the origins of social conflict and disorder, including violence and even maybe warfare, bringing them down back to craving. So we do find traces of this in the Buddha's teaching. And perhaps there were more teachings which were not in this line that were not preserved, because we have to remember that the teachings that have come down to us were the teachings that had been recited, compiled, and preserved by the monastic order. And so the Buddha might have given other teachings to kings and princes, which were not of such interest to the monastics responsible for compiling the texts. But I think also in traditional Buddhism, even though one could say that the monarchy and the Sangha have been mutually supportive, but there have been occasions, and I haven't refreshed my recollection of Sri Lankan history just for this discussion, where when the king departs from the path of righteousness, in the sense of not following the proper dharma, the Sangha will rise up and protest against the king and either try to correct him, or if he seems to be incorrigible, then mobilize to have him deposed from power and to have somebody replace him. Yeah, and for strength of organizations, I have to admit also that Buddhist organizations have been relatively weak, and the situation that you describe seems quite characteristic of what I would call the fairly early stage in the West, the particular way in which Westerners, especially here in the United States, have adopted and maybe appropriated Buddhism from Asia, following the example of Asian teachers who set up the intensive silent meditation retreat as the ideal model of Buddhist practice. So we have in countries like Burma, the Mahasi Sayadaw system, or its counterpart, the U Ba Khin system, which was then conveyed or continued by Goenka. And probably you have counterparts like that with the Zen, some of the Zen teachers in Japan, in which the emphasis is on when you're seriously practicing Buddhism, it means that you go to intensive meditation retreats in which you don't really connect with the other people at all, maybe except on the last day you might have a little chit-chat, then you go home and carry on. And maybe you meet a group of fellow practitioners, and then you might have community practice sessions where you all gather together, and after a little sharing of chit-chat, then somebody hits the bell, and then you sit silently for 30, 45 minutes in meditation, then maybe listen to a recorded Dhamma talk or a live Dhamma talk from the teacher. Then the session comes to an end and everybody goes home. And there's not much interpersonal connections. You know, what I would say is that, in my view, like to challenge the dominant system that we're facing, the system which is creating so much chaos and crisis in the world, I'd say that a major impetus in promoting transformation is in fact going to come from religions, because religions, despite all of their traditional religions, despite all of their weaknesses, what they do is to appeal to the moral sensitivity and conscience of people. And they're able to mobilize people by awakening that sense of conscience and calling them out into the field of action. And here in the West, we as Buddhists, we constitute a very, very small percentage of the people in the United States and probably similarly in Germany. So I think probably the best strategy is to connect with multi-faith organizations which are dedicated to social, economic, and political transformation. Yeah, so we do have like multi-faith organizations that are directed to various types of social transformation. With regard to the climate crisis, there's Green Faith, which has been established by a Christian minister, Fletcher Harper, or is it Harper Fletcher? I always get his name mixed up. And then the organization that I particularly feel a resonance with is the Poor People's Campaign, because it brings together 5 issues, 4 of them that I mentioned: economic disparities, racial injustice, militarism, and climate change, and then also brings together what he calls the false moral narrative, which is used to justify those kinds of transgressive activities. Okay.
Thank you for that. Yes. I appreciate the example of Sri Lanka, and I think I remember vaguely something along that line. My own experience was somewhat different. You know, for me, my main Asian experience was 20 years in Japan practicing Japanese Zen Buddhism. And of course, that's a kind of a counterexample in the sense that from the beginning, when Buddhism came to Japan, it was sort of welcomed by the aristocracy as a means of supporting the state. So Buddhism in Japan, at least, has no sort of real history of challenging the aristocracy or the elite in any way. And in fact, it was careful during the fascist and imperialistic era to sort of, with very few exceptions, go along and support what the government was doing. But then again, I mean, that's not only Buddhism. Look at Christian Europe and Christian United States. It's not only a Buddhist problem by any means. The other, thinking of 2 other examples of religious organizations that are working to address these kinds of issues are, in fact, I would say the 2 groups that are supporting our conversation, Bhante. I mean, Compassion in Action in Germany and also Buddhist Global Relief. I see these as both wonderful examples of the direction, the way that Buddhism can develop in response to the kinds of crises that we face today. Maybe I could follow up by asking a question about your last point regarding sort of religions as playing an essential role because they, in a way, are, I forget the word that you used, but repositories of our, or sources of our moral concern. Yeah. I'm wondering if we could even extend that a bit and see it not only as moral or ethical concern, but also fundamental worldview.
Oh, here. Yeah, definitely. Yeah,
yeah,
definitely.
Yeah. And the reason I mention that is again, both Buddhism and, say, Christianity, if those are our 2 sort of reference points here, both of them seem to me caught up in what some people have called a kind of, it's sort of a fancy term here, but ontological dualism, in the sense that they have supported a certain kind of dissociation or alienation from the earth by focusing our attention on a salvation that seems to involve transcending or escaping this world, right? I mean, in the case of Christianity, we can go back to Genesis, and God makes us and we're special, and he gives us sort of at least stewardship, if not sort of ownership of the rest of the globe, and how within Christianity, in a way, this world becomes a kind of a moral background whereby we can qualify for a blissful eternity with God in heaven. But I'm also raising the same question about Buddhism, insofar as Buddhism has understood the fundamental problem as rebirth into this world, and understood the fundamental soteriological solution as not being reborn back into this material physical world. How much has Buddhism too sort of encouraged the kind of how much has Buddhist practice and teaching tended to divert our attention from what's happening to the earth? Is that enough of a question to respond to, or does that seem too vague?
No, I understand the point that you're making, and I'm a traditional Buddhist. My viewpoint is sort of molded by the canonical teaching. So definitely, I take the ultimate goal of the Buddha's path to be the goal pointed to by the Buddha, which is liberation from the cycle of repeated birth and death. And even I'm fairly familiar with the Mahayana teaching too, at least through its Chinese embodiment, which is those pursuing the Bodhisattva path to Buddhahood, but the purpose of the Buddha is to show beings the path to liberation from birth and death. But I think I don't agree that it's the case that because Buddhists have been focusing on a world-transcending goal, that they inherently and necessarily neglect life within this world. I think we could go back to the teaching of the Buddha himself, who seems to have played both sides of the fence, so to speak, pointing to Nibbana, or Nirvana is the ultimate goal, laying down the path to Nirvana, but also providing teachings concerned with social and economic transformation. And I say that throughout history, I'd say Buddhists have also been looking at the mundane dimensions of life as well as at the transcendent dimensions. Maybe sort of the ideal of rulership that the Buddha set up within the canonical teaching is that of what's called the Chakravarti Raja, the Raja Chakravarti, the wheel-turning monarch, who is in a way the worldly counterpart of a Sammasambuddha, perfectly enlightened Buddha. And so the task of the wheel-turning monarch is to unify the world under the reign of ethics, teaching people, upholding and promoting and proclaiming the 10 courses of wholesome action, and also ruling for the welfare and happiness of the world. And in a way that should provide like an ideal, let's say, a model for any government, in a sense, sort of providing the moral justification for any government. And so now that we no longer have monarchies, or at least dominant monarchies, so we could say in a democratic country, the ideal should be for the government to administer the country for the welfare and happiness of the population. And so as individual citizens and as Buddhists, we should be aspiring to create a government collectively through our individual choices and actions in the political sphere to promote a government which conforms to that model of the wheel-turning monarch.
I think in that regard, we are, more fortunate than the kind of government or the kind of states that the Asian Buddhist cultures had. I mean, my understanding is that given that none of them lived in a democratic polity, right? It's like they had to be very careful how they related to the king or the monarch, and if they got out of line, the danger, of course, is that they could be squashed, and sometimes they were, of course. of course, I don't mean to challenge your Theravada commitment and understanding here, but it's interesting that my own practice as a Zen Buddhist within a kind of contemporary lineage within Japan, I'm just thinking about what my teacher taught, and I'm trying to remember if Yamada Koen Roshi, my master, ever talked about rebirth or nirvana. It's interesting for him. It's not about ultimately transcending this world in the sense of not being reborn back into it, but it's rather through Zen practice we can forget ourselves and open up and experience the world and experience ourselves in the world in a very different way. And so this kind of this is another way of understanding where the Bodhisattva, or now we talk about Ekasattva path, fits in, insofar as we can forget ourselves, let go of ourselves, and overcome our own egoism. Then we ask, well, okay, what can I do to make this world a better place for everyone? And there's a sense in which I don't know if you want to call it more this worldly, but the idea is that what we usually take for granted, the way we usually experience the world as reality, the claim in the Zen practice is, of course, through the practice, we can come to experience it in a non-dual and a very different way, which, as I understand it, has all of these kinds of, I guess we can call them moral implications in terms of the real meaning, what it is that we want to devote ourselves to. Maybe I can follow up with a couple questions.
Just maybe.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So the particular sort of Buddha system that I follow, sort of based on the ancient Nikayas, it has a different structure. It is aiming at liberation from rebirth and the attainment of an unconditioned state of nibbana. But the point I want to make is that does not intrinsically exclude taking effective action within this world. And in fact, even the idea of the bodhisattva gets sort of extended in the Pali commentarial tradition, so that all those who are aiming at enlightenment in any mode, whether as a Sammasambuddha, a disciple of the Buddha, or as a Pratyeka Buddha, Pacceka Buddha, become considered bodhisattvas, aiming at their own type of bodhi, whether it's Anuttara Sammasambodhi, the supreme perfect enlightenment of a fully enlightened Buddha, or the enlightenment of an Arhat, the enlightenment of a Pacceka Buddha. They're still bodhisattvas, and they're still practicing in the Theravada system the 10 paramitas, which include qualities like generosity, ethical conduct, loving kindness, and the 4 Brahmaviharas, including compassion. So all of those qualities are there, even within a model aimed ultimately at world transcendence.
So,
and within the living Theravada tradition, the problem is to get people to aim at nibbana rather than just at a heavenly rebirth.
So, which raises questions about how we might understand karma as merit, for example. But actually, before that might be something worth getting into. But since we've been talking about the Bodhisattva path, to be quite frank, it seems to me this might be the single most important contribution that Buddhism has to offer to the kind of crucial situation that we have today, insofar as, at least as I understand it, the Bodhisattvas have a double practice. They continue to work on their own personal, individual transformation, but they're also aware that isn't sufficient, that they're also at the same time doing the very best they can to work for the betterment of everyone. And I think it's, as we were saying, I think it's become clear in the modern world that action has to address structural, institutional challenges as well, and the importance of bringing those two together, because historically, at least, many Buddhists, as in many other religions, the focus has been on our own individual salvation. whether it's meditating for nibbana or more often in popular Buddhism, accumulating merit, as you said, for a better lifetime next time around. And then on the other side, how it is that activists can be so often sort of burned out because they don't have a kind of grounding in the kind of equanimity that something like Buddhist meditation practice can provide. So it really seems to me, and I guess I'm asking for your response to this, that this may be the single most important contribution of Buddhism, this somewhat modified understanding of the Bodhisattva path?
I say, if you take it in that broad sense, then I'd say certainly, and I don't want to say that every Buddha should be aiming at the Anuttara Sammasambodhi, which is probably a very rare and very exceptional. But certainly I would say that it's our responsibility today. In fact, we could see this again as traceable back to the Buddha's early teachings, where he speaks about 4 kinds of people found in the world. The one who aims neither for his own good or the good of others, the one who aims at his own good, but not the good of others, the one who aims at the good of others, but not at his own good, and the one who aims at the good of both. And then the Buddha not only declares that the last one is the best of the 4, but he uses a whole string of synonyms to extol the last one. He is the best, the supreme, the foremost, the most excellent, the exalted, the cream of the crop, so to speak. Yeah, but what I would add to this is that probably the task of facing sort of these massive social, economic, political problems is something with which most traditional Buddhists are not, at least until maybe the early 20th century, were not acquainted.
So
largely because in the earlier centuries, the dominant form of government was monarchy, in which if you stand up against monarchy, if you're an ordained monastic, you could do it in many cases. If you're not, you'd better keep your mouth shut. Okay, so up to the 18th century, 19th century, dominant form is monarchy. 18th, 19th century, early 20th century, European colonial powers governing the country. And so it's only perhaps in the 20th century that Buddhist thinkers started to get keen insights into the way political power works and the way it's tied up with economic and social power. And so then you have the emergence of the socially engaged types of Buddhism, which is not by no means a Western invention. It already started in Asia, early 20th century, with maybe Anagarika Dharmapala, then especially keen analysis with Ambedkar in India, my friend Arya Ratna, A.T. Arya Ratna in Sri Lanka, Thich Nhat Hanh in Vietnam.
Sulak Sivaraksha in...
Yeah. And the International Network of Engaged Buddhists in Thailand. And so you get Buddhists, who are already sort of somewhat deeply grounded in the Dharma, now starting to look at the problems that their countries are facing, either during the colonial period or after the colonial period, or in Thailand, no colonial rule, but still facing, because of modernization and Westernization, and trying to work out solutions to this.
Shall we have some questions in between?
David, did you have some other questions that you want, or points that you wanted to make?
Yes, if it's okay here.
Yeah.
One quick comment first is one of the things I really appreciate about Buddhism, of course, is the foundational emphasis on impermanence and insubstantiality, and how that really applies to the institutionalization of Buddhism as well. In other words, I think what we're talking about is not sort of is not just a critique of Buddhism, but it's actually what we're doing is what Buddhism encourages us to do, in the sense that Buddhism wanting to grow, to become as relevant and as salvific as possible in the modern era. This is true to the fundamental Buddhist mission, and I guess I just wanted to emphasize that. But the two questions I do have, I'd be very interested in your attitude toward two issues. One of them I already mentioned about sort of karma and merit. Given the kind of challenges we face today, does that reflect on the way that karma has been understood? And you could go with that where you want. The other issue, of course, is that in the modern world, or certainly in the Western world, the role or the traditional Asian Buddhist split between monastics and lay people, it doesn't seem to be functioning in quite the same way, right? Most of the practitioners in the West are lay people. And I'm wondering how you see that transformation affecting the kinds of concerns we're talking about here. Is there any implication there in terms of social engagement with those two issues, karma and monasticism?
I'll take that aspect first. The second question. I have to say that the spread of Buddhism amongst lay people here in the US and in the West has led to maybe much more sophisticated, let's say, perspectives on social challenges that we face that one would be able to get from from monastics who don't have that exposure to living within society.
Interesting.
Particularly, a lot of the young Westerners who adopt Buddhism have had college educations in which they might have been trained in sociology, economic theory, philosophical, analytical theory, and that gives them the kind of intellectual equipment to look at those kinds of challenges, which they say ordinary lay people in Asian countries might not have. Traditional Buddhist countries might not have. As far as karma and merit,
does it have any implications for something like collective karma or institutional karma? I mean, in a way, I think it does critique sort of the understanding of karma as merit making, but then many things can be said about that.
I explain merit as wholesome karma, which is the classical definition. And so wholesome karma is generated by doing good deeds, wholesome deeds, which are traditionally summed up in the three actions of practice of generosity, of ethical observance, and meditative cultivation. But what I would say, maybe the idea of merit has to be sort of expanded and extended into peacefully implemented, socially transformative action. Maybe that does not enter into the traditional understanding of merit, because in a traditional society in which, as I said, the dominant political form is that of monarchy, you don't strive very energetically for political transformation if you want to keep your head on your neck.
So if, say, activists are engaged in protesting, say, oil pipelines, would they be accumulating wholesome merit?
I would say so, even though that might not be a dominant sort of the intention, but I would say that it is, if it's springing from a compassionate concern for the well-being of other people, then it's certainly.
So,
and I should say, in my own thinking, the idea of generating merit doesn't form a very prominent motivation in my action. I'm sort of driven to do what is good simply because it's good, necessary, and beneficial, not because I want to accumulate merits to ensure myself of a better rebirth. I do accept the idea of rebirth, and I want to ensure that I have a rebirth where I will come back into connection with the Buddha's teaching and not get separated from it.
So I actually have very much the same attitude, in the sense that, it's really important for us to do the best we can apart from a kind of selfish concern for the sort of merit that we might be accumulating afterwards. And perhaps this is all the more important in the modern era where, lots of people sort of don't know what to make of cosmological karma and physical rebirth. I mean, in a way, you can put it on a shelf. You don't have to reject it, but you could still put it on a shelf and say, I don't know. But in any case, the best thing I can do to promote it is to do the very best I can now and let that take care of itself.
Okay, Raymond, did you want to?
Yes, so maybe it's a good time to open up for some question or comments. Carla, would you start to summarize some of the question or comments so far?
Okay, quite a few people sent in notes about different organizations that are actually doing work in these sort of areas. I wanted to mention someone talked about Joan Halifax at Upaya Monastery in New Mexico, the Birken Forest Monastery in Canada, I believe, https://birken.ca. So I believe that's Canada. And some others were mentioned. Let me see. Also, Raymond, you mentioned Tzu Chi Foundation, which is a Taiwanese organization, and I have experience running into them in post-disaster situations. They do a lot of really good work. So I think there is a lot being done by different organizations. Perhaps the issue is getting these organizations together to exercise perhaps more collective power, or I hate to say the word, but I'm a political scientist, political power. And that is difficult because as registered nonprofit organizations, many of us do not have that option. We have to legally stay out of politics. So I think this is something that we all have to be a little bit careful about. But it doesn't mean we can't act collectively. It just means we have to be careful what we do and how we do it. Okay, so much for that.
Could I just say something in response to what you just said?
Please, Fontaine.
Yeah. It seems to me that I think David has made this distinction too. Two modes of socially engaged Buddhism. One is what you might call a humanitarian or philanthropic, which is concerned with working within the dominant system in ways that will promote the well-being, security, health, and happiness of people who are being excluded, oppressed, marginalized, harmed by that system. So this we can call maybe the humanitarian branch of engaged Buddhism. And then the other, I would call what would be a good expression, the critical and transformative expression of engaged Buddhism, which is aimed at sort of analyzing dominant political and social structures, looking at them critically, and then proposing and even advocating for and agitating for alternatives that are that will embody and express Buddhist ethical ideals of, say, justice, compassion. Well, those that are expressing compassion, of justice, greater equity, ecological sustainability, and so forth. Okay, you're going to continue?
No, that was really great. And then another person was talking about...
Could I mention just a couple other examples of, especially the second one? Within the United States here, we have Zen peacemakers, of course. And I think this would be along the lines of the more progressive or critical that Bhante was talking about. We have Zen peacemakers. We also have BPF, Buddhist Peace Fellowship, and also more recently One Earth Sangha, which is focused on ecological issues. Sorry to interrupt, Carla. Go ahead.
No, that's great. That's great. Like I said, there are so many things out there. When you start looking, you see them, and you're like, "Oh, this is wonderful." So I don't know where we can go for that collectively. One person on this Zoom call did want to talk about he's interested in using GIS to map Buddhist-owned lands, because different Buddhist organizations own lands, and would like to map them to see, are they actually indigenous lands? Can they be used for, some way or another? So this person is interested in perhaps getting some of the people on this call together later to discuss these issues. And so I said I would offer the option of anyone who wants to do that. I can share your emails if you opt in, sort of. but perhaps we would have to set up a system whereby anyone who was interested in setting up sort of an email list where people could share, if you're interested in this sort of issue, let me know through info@Buddhist Global Relief. Just type a short message to me and I will take on, among all the other things, whatever, I will just collate all those emails and share them of those only who wish to be in this, okay? So that, for what it's worth, I wanted to get that out there. There are a few other items that I think might be of interest to people. Ayadama Deepa says that many people who are not Buddhists see Buddhism as not having much of a moral compass. That's perhaps on us for not communicating so well. They think that Buddhists are self-involved and don't care about God's moral judgment. Well, we don't, think about God in the same way they do. Evidenced by visible instances of unethical behavior of Buddhist teachers. Well, what spiritual organization has not had unethical behavior? But then she goes on to say, do you think that Buddhism needs to assert its moral voice in order to have a greater impact on world crises? Or should we simply appeal to people's long-term self-interest and desire for self-preservation? So do our panelists have anything to say to that?
Do you want to take that, Dave?
So if I understood the question right, should we be appealing to the larger moral compass, or should it be more in terms of self-interest? And it seems to me one of the interesting implications of our situation today is that it involves both, right? I mean, I think any kind of distinction between them is false and deceptive. I mean, of course, that kind of distinction is kind of natural. It's sort of built into a certain kind of sense of separate self and the kind of self-preoccupation that goes into it. But as Buddhist teachings pretty clearly imply, I would say, and I'm sure Bhante might want to comment on this as well, that really we can't separate the two. That doing the best we can for everyone is also going to be doing the best we can for ourselves. But Bhante, would you?
Yeah, no, I just would agree. Yeah.
Okay. We also have a question from Vancouver, and Dhammashrek mentions that this is the traditional land of the Coast Salish people, as my home in the U.S., Seattle. His question refers to the mindset of human-animal-other divide, and basically he is very interested in how we overcome this sort of divide that sees human rebirth as the highest rebirth. And we vow not to inflict suffering on others, such as animals. So he's trying to, okay, how do we get all this to work together? How much do Buddhists have to overcome this view to really heal our relationship with the earth and all its inhabitants, human or other, to tackle the climate catastrophe? And I would add one that he did not mention there, that in some of the suttas that Bhante translated, it was horrifying to me to read sometimes mentions of how, and perhaps it wasn't in the suttas, but where I read it somewhere, about men being thankful that they were not reborn as women, or that women should try to be reborn as men, which absolutely horrifies me. I am definitely cis female. So
one actually doesn't. I don't think one finds that at all in the Pali Suttas.
Thank you. I'm glad to hear that. It must have been someplace else, and just horrified me. So, but this human-animal split, where we see ourselves as superior, is this a problem? How do we, work with this and respect and love the earth, at the same time?
One of the things that I've always respected very much about Buddhism is that it doesn't fall into that Abrahamic problem of creating this strong distinction. It's like when you look, say, at the Ten Commandments and not killing, it's only regarding other humans. In fact, usually humans of one's own tribe, actually, that would have been the original understanding. Whereas Buddhism, like Jainism and many other Indian traditions, doesn't seem to have that kind of distinction, in the sense that, as we know, right, bodhisattvas in the Zen tradition, we take vows to save all living, all sentient beings. I think it's might be literally all breathing beings. So in that regard, there's a kind of non-duality realizing the connection. But of course, what you're pointing to is the fact of understanding human rebirth as the best possible. I think there's two sides to it, frankly. I think there is something special about being a human being, which doesn't necessarily imply a sense of kind of moral superiority. I think that humans have the possibility of waking up to our non-duality with other living beings and taking responsibility. It's like there's the possibility of waking up in a way that we understand the meaning of our lives as working for the well-being of everyone. So it's a kind of ironic. Our specialness is to realize the sense in which we're not special. If you can understand that kind of paradox. I mean, I think it's really... It's ridiculous to say that we're not special in some way, given what we've done to the earth. I mean, given the kind of civilizations that we've created for better and worse, we are unique. It doesn't mean we are, quote unquote, morally better in the way that we can use and abuse the other species. No, but nonetheless, I see the challenge as understanding and appreciating the possible responses built into what it means to be a human, both individually and collectively, to work for the well-being of the whole, to promote the health of the ecosystems and the whole of the biosystem. So it's that kind of paradox that stands out for me.
Now, certainly, I would say human beings have certain capacities that animals, as far as we know, do not have. And within the Buddhist cosmology, it's the human. First, it's said that Buddhas, fully enlightened Buddhas, arise only within the human realm. I guess because it's only within the human realm that a being is possible that can comprehend the ultimate nature of things in all of their dimensions and in that way serve as a Buddha. And I say that certainly the spiritual faculties of a human being, to my knowledge, are more developed than that of animals, though maybe some of the deer outside grazing on the lawn will raise some objections to that. But very much, I say, like animals.
They might actually be more developed than us.
Well, certainly they live much more in harmony with the natural environment than we do. So we have, and they've never devised things like any kind of mechanical weapon, not to speak of nuclear weapons, with the capacity to obliterate all life on Earth. But still, it's the human beings that have, I would say, the capacity for moral discrimination and choice, and the greater capacity for spiritual development and realization, whereas animals very much live within the boundaries that are that are sort of assigned to them by nature.
One way to ask the question is the suffering, is the dukkha, the pain of animals, of less value than, say, the pain of human beings? That's a very, I mean, and one could go into that in various ways, but I think that's one way to express the challenge. I mean, do we want to separate out our own dukkha suffering and think that naturally a lot more important than the suffering of the deer on that lawn outside?
Yeah, that leads into one person who did raise the issue of perhaps attention to the human habit of eating other species. Should be addressed. Commitment to refraining from killing sentient beings, and in light of the violent domination of the world and the ecological devastation resulting from it, from the exploitation of animals, perhaps should be part of this conversation as well.
I think this is a very interesting example of how Buddhism can be understood to develop in different historical, social contexts. Of course, in the time of the Buddha, where the monastics were all mendicants and they had to eat what they were given, a strong vegetarianism would have been very difficult, maybe impossible to sort of enforce for Buddhist monastics. Later, of course, that that develops, especially in China. But it seems to me that as Buddhism has come into the modern world, as we've learned more about the nature of animals, animal sentience, as we've learned more about nutrition and what's necessary and what isn't necessary, I mean, it seems to me a kind of natural development that we move more in the direction, at least, of a, reduction in terms of how much we're taking advantage of other species for our own nutrition.
Yeah, and that should be true not only from a purely ethical standpoint, but also from the pragmatic standpoint, that to grow, I think it's like 1 pound of animal flesh for consumption requires like 6 to 8 pounds of cereals, of grains, and beans that could be used to feed so many more people. So that when we develop a culture which is committed to large-scale meat consumption, then those who are consuming meat are indirectly consuming large quantities of grain that could be used to feed millions and millions of other people who are just surviving on the barest minimum amount of food, and in many cases not even that much, so that we have something like, 6 million people living on the verge on substandard diets, suffering from chronic malnutrition in the world today. And unfortunately, the trend is that as an economy develops, like, for example, in China today, then people start to transition from a plant-based diet to a diet in which meat plays an increasingly more prominent role.
There are 2 other points that I would like to share for a little short discussion at least. The first one is, this discourse seems to mostly run along how could Buddhist organizations become socially active? However, this person raised the question of how can Buddhist organizations function better than traditional political or social activist groups? It's sort of a devil's advocate position. Are we going to do any better than those that have already come before us in or are we just going to carry our own problems into any organizations that we form to promote our ideals? Again, that's sort of a position that's moving back towards the personal as opposed to the collective. So perhaps this person is seeking for some balance. I don't know exactly what they had in mind, but are there any reflections that you have about the Buddhist potential for doing better than Christians or Jews or Muslims?
I don't think we have to compare ourselves with other religious organizations. But if I understand the question or the point that person is making, he seems to be advocating just individual conscientious action rather than Buddhists coming together to form groups aimed at collective action. And if that is the case, if I understand the point correctly, then I would just disagree with that. And I'd say maybe this is a major stumbling block or a weak spot in many, many Buddhist communities, that they see the aim of adopting Buddhism just to engage in an individual practice, thinking that it's sufficient to act responsibly in accordance with one's own individual conscience, rather than come together for collective purposes. And I mean, every organization will have its problems. That seems to be inherent in the nature when people come together for a common purpose. But that's the challenge, is to set up sort of guidelines and practices that reduce sort of internal disputes and conflicts and stagnation, and to enable everybody to contribute most effectively to the functioning of the organization. But I'd say certainly when people come together to form an organization, if they have the proper guidelines, the right attitude, the right orientation, then they will be able to be much more effective than just individuals in their own personal capacity, trying to do their best.
Another way to take the question would be, is it appropriate for Buddhists to sort of form their own, what am I trying to say here? Do we need a Buddhist political party, for example? And I would say no, for a number of reasons. In other words, the issue is not whether Buddhists should stand out completely in the sense that we keep separate from other groups, but often I think it'll be the case that Buddhists, both individually and collectively, will participate in other organizations. So, for example, I'm a member of 350.org and such organizations, and I think that's appropriate. And I think one of the reasons, maybe it's a little bit different, but I also think there's a danger, and I've seen this in a couple, say, Zen organizations, where it's possible to create a problem if the assumption in the Zen organization is that everyone is going to want to be on the same page politically. In other words, do we want, say, a particular Zen group, does it want to make it clear that conservatives, Republicans, people who have different points of view are not welcome there? And I think it's really important to avoid that. So, rather than making that some kind of assumption about what it means to be involved in that group, I could still see that most maybe of the people in that organization might also want to form a group that's socially engaged, but that there shouldn't be the assumption within the meditation orientation itself that everyone has to have the same kind of political viewpoint.
Yeah, definitely important that we all maintain an open heart and mind towards each other and respect each other. And that, again, leads to this last question that has come up. What about secular Buddhists who don't put Nibbana and rebirth on the shelf, but seem to table the discussion completely except in terms of this life only? So I'm not sure, that was kind of a short question, but it is interesting that we have some Buddhists who are absolutely not interested in the rebirth aspects of Buddhism, but I don't see why that would preclude them from engaging in sila.
I don't have any problem if somebody considers themselves to be a secular Buddhist. I'm not a secular Buddhist myself, since I accept traditional Buddhist worldview. But I would say that when it comes to the sphere of social engagement, maybe we need more of a secular spirit in Buddhism. No, seriously, because maybe a premise of secular Buddhism is that we have to look at the problems that we are facing collectively, socially, within this life itself. And I see that that's also an important aim of traditional Buddhism, maybe underemphasized. And so maybe secular Buddhism is sort of challenging traditional Buddhism to give more prominence to that particular undercurrent of thought within traditional Buddhism, to articulate it more explicitly and to formulate clear positions in relation to some of the major challenges that we face today.
Whether the Buddhism is traditional or secular, I think an important part of it is this critique of the delusion of separate self, and that our practice involves, in one way and another, overcoming this sense of separation and realizing our interdependence, realizing that therefore my well-being is not separate from your well-being. So in that way too, I think that, for secular Buddhists, it does follow that there would be this concern for the well-being of the whole.
In fact, maybe secular Buddhism arose partly as a reaction to what they perceived as an excessive emphasis on world transcending or otherworldly aspirations in traditional Buddhism.
I think so, yeah.
So there have been, through beginning with in the 20th century, attempts to recover a more this worldly emphasis, even within the framework of traditional Buddhist systems. I think of, in China, Venerable Taishu with Buddhism for Human Life, Master Yin Shun with Human Realm Buddhism, and then again some of the ones we mentioned, Sarvodaya, the International Network of Engaged Buddhists, and so forth.
someone addressed a question to Bhante.
Oh.
The cause of suffering is because of craving, the second noble truth. Can you give your view as to how humanity in general and individuals can work to reduce craving? We've been talking about that a lot today, haven't we?
I'm trying to think of it at a collective level, not so much at
Yes.
an individual level. And I would say that probably one of the major challenges that we face at the collective level is the way the dominant economic system, that of corporate capitalism, to flourish, it depends upon continually stimulating new desires, ever-changing desires, and dissatisfaction in the population at large. And so that is what is creating a kind of havoc where we're never really satisfied with what we have, and that leads to this inflamed consumerism. And at the same time that they are stimulating more and more desires in people, to maintain their grip on the economy, they have to exploit people both within their own countries, particularly Western countries, as well as exploit the resources of the traditional parts of the world in order to manufacture the goods that they need to continue the to promote continuous and apparently infinite economic growth, which leads to massive ecological devastation. David, maybe you have some further.
Well, no, I think that's exactly right. I'm happy you use the word consumerism because, frankly, it seems to me that could be understood as the real religion of the modern world. If we understand religion as teaching us, what's really important about the world and how to live in it and how to relate to it. It seems to me religions can get so caught up in sort of competing with each other, but the real challenge is how do we understand and address that fundamental sort of worldview value system. Yeah. So again, it's the institutionalization, like we started talking about, the institutionalization of what has usually been understood as an individual problem.
Yeah.
I sincerely believe that we are in an unsustainable world economic system. And sort of the definition of unsustainable is that it will not last. So the question is not whether it will fail or not. The question is how, when, and what we will do when it does.
Is that a question or a comment?
No, that's a comment. Yeah. Economists are sort of the high priests of the world political economic system. And I have absolutely despised most economists for years. I did find people like Herman Daly, who, actually tells the truth about reality in his economic studies. And so there are economists who have a clue, but they are rare.
Yeah, there are a couple of good recent books on sort of Buddhist economics.
Yes, yes,
I don't have the titles with me exactly now.
I know I have at least one.
I'm sorry. Speaking personally here, and I'm not a scientist, so, but from what I can see, the kind of situation that we're in is not sustainable.
Yeah.
So I'm agreeing in the sense that I think there is going to be a breakdown. In fact, maybe we can argue it's already happening. So the question isn't, will there be a breakdown? Will there be a catastrophe? The question is, how is it going to unfold and how quickly? And what might Buddhism, how might Buddhist teachings and practices and people doing those practices, what might our role be in terms of reducing the dukkha that's going to be involved in that? Bhante, what would you say?
I agree that there's going to be a massive devastation and breakdown. The big problem with climate, what you call devastation, is that it's so difficult for the human mind to wrap, or for human beings to wrap their minds around a problem that is though it has occasional immediately visible destructive outbreaks, like the heat waves that we've been having now, wildfires. But on the whole, the general tendency is towards a slow, gradual, incremental increase in which the full consequences lie somewhat distant in the future, maybe 10 years from now, 20 years from now. So it's so difficult for the human mind to human beings to wrap their minds around that kind of problem. And I just don't have a easy answer to that. And what's very sad, what's very disturbing is that the ones who are going to feel the fullest impact of climate devastation are going to be people living in the traditional parts of the world, in sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, South and Southeast Asia, people who are the least responsible for climate emissions. But even in the United States, I mean, we could already see this out in the West Coast, Washington State, Oregon, California, Nevada, these massive forest fires consuming already 1 million acres of forest. Last year was 4 million acres. Easy answers?
No easy answers here to any of this. It is about time for us to be winding down, and some interesting resources have been mentioned during this. If anyone has anything else that they would like to share, again, please send anything to me at info@buddhistglobalrelief.org, and I will let those who want to be in on this know. As far as a Facebook group, if you guys want to start a Facebook group, you're on your own, because I'm terrible with Facebook. So, but let me know if you want to start one, and I can, say, hey, somebody start one. But it was mentioned that some Facebook groups do already exist. Let's see, the Green Buddhist Organization, the Engaged Buddhist group, has a Facebook group. So you might actually, if you're a Facebook person, go on Facebook yourself. I would recommend that. So,
could I add maybe as another organization, I'm one of the founders of the relatively new Rocky Mountain Eco-Dharma Retreat Center. That's rmerc.org. And there's lots of materials on our site, as well as the fact that we offer various types of meditative retreats, and some of them are concerned to address the kinds of issues that we're talking about here, in particular what we call eco-dharma retreats. And if you'll excuse the personal reference, if people want to follow up on the sort of things that I've been saying, I have a website too, davidloy.org, where there's lots of materials, mostly in English, but some in other languages.
So I guess it's my turn to kind of round it up. And I want to say thank you to Bhante and to David for taking time for this discussion, for giving us inspiration and impulses. And I would like to add for our German listeners, they are different to the States probably. We are a very small group of Buddhists in Germany. We are actually very minor compared to other groups, especially religious groups or organization in general. And just here in this Zoom, there are different people from different very small groups who engage in some way. And we found out that with this work of Mitgefühl in Aktion, we actually could come together more easily and find ways to connect and help each other. So I think one thing that Buddhist Global Relief and Mitgefühl in Aktion is standing for is that no matter where we are coming from which background of Buddhism and which way of Buddhist practice, I think we Buddhists should have a voice in society, should engage with other groups, even Extinction Rebellion, and should show that we care for the well-being of beings. And I think a very important thing is, like I was reading in the beginning, there actually a huge number of people who suffer severely from shortage of food in this crisis and all the crises that this world faces. And one way to help directly is really actually doing small work of aid, food aid, help, nutrition, and helping people to find education and to build up their places after disasters. And so please open your hearts and your pocket also to, even with finances, to help where we can do small works of aid. That would be my request. So thank you very much for this first shared event between United States and Germany. It's a good beginning. I hope you enjoyed it. And thank you very much again to our speakers, to Carla and to Simpa, to everyone who was involved.
And let me thank David, especially for joining us. Back in the pre-COVID days, occasionally when David was on the East Coast, he would come to visit me and stay overnight at Huangyan Monastery. We would sit around the table here in the evening and have interesting talks over tea, evening tea. We haven't had a chance to do that in quite some time, but now we're doing it over Zoom.
I miss that very much, and I look forward to future opportunities. Yeah. Thank you, Bhante.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you all.
Stay healthy and have a very good weekend, and lift up the light, do the good work. Thank you.
And so are you, Raymond. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Raymond, Bhante,
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Carla, and the team. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Okay,
Bye-bye.